Well, Bill, why don't we begin by your explaining what got you and your board involved in diversity and inclusion? What's made this a high priority to you?
Well, Doug, this is a topic that has been growing for me personally, and I do feel talking about this in our industry and my community, there's experts that are much better at articulating diversity and inclusion and initiatives in that area. I've got some board members who have been consistently asking me about the diversity of our management team and executive team, and I really had to do some personal learning myself to feel like I understood their question. Our community has had conversations about Black Lives Matter and racial equity, and I had to really lean in to understand at whatever level I do now, but to understand it a little bit better. When I first took over, I hired individuals that contributed to a diverse executive and leadership team. But what I found is if you just have one person on a team that represents a particular race or ethnicity, having them at their best is pretty difficult. And what I mean by being at their best is, do they feel comfortable in the environment? Do they see people who really understand who they are and what they're trying to accomplish? When you have someone who has a diverse background and you just, they can be minimized. And I think there was a point in time where we may have done that unconsciously. But I make the distinction between just having someone that represents a diverse race or ethnicity and then a culture of inclusion, where diversity to me is who's in the room, and inclusion is when people are in the room, are they being heard? Are they being respected? Are we really understanding each other and trying to address issues, understanding exactly what people are saying? And so after I had board members say, Bill, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I've spent a little over 3 years on personal growth, first in a program where I was connected one-on-one with a black gentleman who I had known for a long time, but it turns out I had never really known him. And he and I have been having breakfast together once a month for 3 years. And Doug, I said to him the last time we met, you know, Van, the first time we met, I thought, boy, it's pretty lucky that he has someone like me to be meeting with on a monthly basis. And after a period of time, I said, geez, I'm pretty lucky to be meeting with someone like Van. About 6 months ago, I was describing what was going on in my day and the month ahead, and Van offered some very perceptive advice. And it took that long, 2.5 years, before I really had gotten past my own unconscious bias to see that Dan was just another person with wisdom about life. And so the last time we met, I said, Van, I just want to let you know the progression that we've gone through in our relationship, that you're now my friend who's black instead of a black person who's a friend. And how do I bring that transformational consciousness at a regional transit service here in Rochester and create an environment that it's not just the right people sitting in the room, but whoever is in the room feels like I can say something, it will be heard, I'll be respected. If someone disagrees, they have the comfort to articulate their perspective and really begin to have some very meaningful conversations. And as I've reflected this back to my board members, they're appreciating not just the personal growth I've taken, but the organizational steps we've taken with the goal of having RTS really begin to have a diverse workforce a competency in the area of inclusion.
Excuse me, Bill, why don't, I think you're moving here anyway.
Yeah.
Why don't we move into some of the concrete initiatives or steps that you've taken at RTS on this diversity and inclusion front, if you will?
So the program that I went through a little over 3 years ago was a 6-month program, and I required everyone on our executive team to go through the program. And when I say required, really encouraged the other members of our executive team one by one to make sure that they participated, and so that we had a common language and a common understanding on the need to understand really what it is, Doug. And it's difficult in a room to talk about unconscious bias, because if it's unconscious, people aren't sure what you're talking about.
That's right.
And so after our group had been through it, we then took the top 25 leaders in our organization through an 8-week program. Now,
is this a program offered by an educational institution, or?
This is a program operated by one of the local not-for-profits in our community that deals specifically with racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the first meeting where they were talking about, what is racial equity and what is the what I call the business case for diversity, I saw that there were many people in the room that said, there isn't anything wrong with me. I've worked hard to get where I am. I don't have any special privileges that have gotten me here. And then as the program went on and people began to understand a little bit of perhaps some of the things like redlining in our city, the city of Rochester, back in the 40s and 50s, they really concentrated the black population in specific neighborhoods. I was not aware of that. The way the GI Bill worked better for some races than other races, such that as a white man, I've had generational advantage over some other members of my community. And when you're unconscious to that, and you just think everyone needs to work hard and not see the barriers that others in my community have to work through, we all have to work hard to be successful. But our community, our institutions do put some barriers for women, for blacks, Hispanics, that make it more difficult. And so part of our training program was to identify what some of those barriers are, and then begin to talk about what we can do to minimize or eliminate those barriers.
Let me jump in and make sure our listeners are with us here. So remind me, who went through the program? These were how many of your senior executives or managers?
This was the top 25 leaders in our organization.
Big commitment then, 25. And how many hours?
It was 8 hours of training spread out over a number of months, so that we could have the training, we could reflect, have the training, we could reflect.
So a big commitment, actually. 8 hours.
Significant commitment, and everyone on the leadership team understands this is being led by the CEO, that this is an area that I'm passionate about.
So you participated?
I did.
Oh, my gosh, okay. So you didn't just lecture about it, you actually went through that.
I went through the program, and at each session I would reflect back for the group. Here's what I'm thinking as a result of today's topic. And I remember thinking at the end of one of the sessions, just saying, in all my personal work, I don't feel, Doug, like I'm racist. I don't feel like I've got this bias that I try to exhibit. But there are behaviors and systems that do create barriers for others in our community. I was at a luncheon recently. A woman came up to talk to me, and a man talked right over her, and she just stopped him and said, "Excuse me, I was talking to Bill Carpenter." And she told me afterwards how long it took in her life for men to come up and just answer for her. And I began to watch myself in other settings where it was natural for me to do the same thing. I was unconscious to it. So there's a lot of, and Doug, as we share this with others around the country, there's going to be some people that say, well, I don't do that. And there were a lot of things, as I've been through this, I don't do that. And I began to wake up and find I do that. I do participate in that. Wow,
but you
how
were
do
not
I change?
conscious necessarily of that.
I was not conscious of it.
This was kind of an eye-opener then, going through this training.
And another example is, the idea of I always want to hire the best person. And yet when I talk about hiring the best person, I'll say, well, geez, we need someone with this expertise. We need someone with that expertise. I found until very recently, I wasn't appreciating the value of someone who is different than me to be on the team. And I'm talking about different racially and ethnically, such that, someone might say, well, we need someone with a real expertise in finance. And what I'm telling my team is, look around your team. Do you have someone who can represent our population, who can represent our employees? Are they represented?
And looking for
Exactly.
What other things have you, initiatives have you taken in addition to the training program?
So we have a wellness committee that we're very fortunate to have a beautiful wellness center. And it turns out that gym, there's about 25 pieces of equipment. We do classes 3 days a week. Anyone can go in and use the equipment, take classes together, and the stripes are left at the door. Everyone's got their workout clothes on. And that becomes a place where it's no longer a manager and an employee, finance versus engineering. It's how many push-ups can you do, or how long were you on the treadmill, and creating a safe place for people to get to know each other differently. And that wellness committee is being expanded to be a wellness and inclusion committee, so that specific initiatives are designed to make sure that the whole kaleidoscope of employees, levels of the organization, races, ethnicity, male and female gender, sexual orientation, that there's a wide variety of people who have a common goal and begin to create a nucleus where this can be replicated through the organization. And another step we've taken is to establish some mentoring relationships for people that have made it through barriers. One of my executives was the first county executive in our community. She has a number of women in the organization she's taken under her wing on what are the real and perceived barriers to moving up in an organization like ours, and how do you speak up in the room? How do you make your voice heard? When someone speaks over you, and I've heard it when a woman cuts off a man, well, you're too aggressive. And then if the woman doesn't speak up, well, you're too passive. And how do you find that balance where You're not a man or a woman. You're just professionals trying to solve problems, come up with solutions to do a better job for our community. And Maggie has a terrific gift at getting the women she mentors to have that perspective and get past some of the barriers they have.
So is this a formal mentoring program, like you have a way of assigning mentors to particular individuals, or how does it work?
What we've done with our leadership team is to say if you want to move ahead, encourage having a mentoring relationship. So it's not formal assignments, but it's not silent either. It's the opportunity is made available, and again, Maggie in particular has just done a tremendous job with a number of people that have come to her and meet with her on a regular basis.
Well, you've obviously taken a number of really important steps toward not only diversity but inclusion as well. Bill, stepping back and thinking about what you've gone through, what do you see as some of the impacts thus far?
Doug, where I see the most impact, I spend 30 minutes with every new employee group when they go through orientation, talking about the values that we have: integrity, respect, diversity and inclusion, engagement and collaboration, service excellence, and performance focus. And I gauge the room when I talk about diversity and inclusion. When I talk about what are some of the barriers in society. And an example I use is my son is white, recently got an FHA mortgage. In order to move into the house, he had to break his lease. Everything was all set up. And 4 days before closing, he got a phone call from the bank saying, "We've done an analysis and you're $3,000 short of closing, and we need to see $3,000 more in your bank account or you won't be able to buy the house." And I'll tell that story and look at the group and say, how many of you would be able to come up with that $3,000 on such short notice? And when people talk about privilege, is that a privilege that my son has, that he could give me a call and say, "Can you help me out, Dad?" Because if he didn't have anyone, he had to move out of his apartment. He's lost his earnest payment on the house. He's lost the sweat labor he put in so that the house would pass inspection with the FHA. And he was going to save $300 a month on his housing costs. You would think they would do everything they can to make it easy for him to get that mortgage, and instead it's barrier after barrier after barrier. And those with privilege are able to get over those barriers.
Right.
And when I share that type of a story, I will tell you those who push against barriers all the time look at me like maybe this Bill Carpenter gets it. And there's others in the room that say, I don't understand the story. And that's why this is such a topic where there's a consciousness with so many and an unconsciousness with others. And so having the conversation on a regular basis that those who are black and female and Hispanic, and our wellness coordinator is from Korea, to know it's okay for me to express who I am, and if I run into a barrier, I can talk to someone in leadership or on the executive team or the CEO and say, this is still a barrier that here at RTS we need to knock down.
So thus far, your consensus has been well worth the time and effort you've put in. Change.
Well, what I'm seeing for sure, Doug, is there is change. This is a common conversation at the leadership team level. The steps that we're putting in this year, it will be part of the annual performance review process as we start our new year. That, you know, what are your goals for diversity and what are your goals for inclusion? And I understand there's departments where there may be 6 white men and women, They don't do any hiring, so Bill, what do you want me to do about diversity? Well, what I want you to do about diversity then is get out in the community, go ride the bus, understand our customers better, develop better competency of inclusion, sit with our employees in the break room, make sure that you understand the value that the other employees bring. There's a real hero, and I feel badly I didn't understand this about him until he retired, but we had a bus operator. I always held him in high regard, but it was just a black bus operator, and when he retired, I invited him in my office and said, so tell me your story. How did you come to work here and you stayed 30 years? Well, he came from Nigeria, went to school in Canada, got his bachelor's degree. I met his wife in Canada. She's from Jamaica. They went to Nigeria. And her brother came to the United States in the early 80s. They followed him to Rochester in 83 and 84, and he was working tool and die, taking the bus back and forth. But when he was in Nigeria, before he came to the United States, he had owned his own business. A successful businessman, came here, language barriers, racial barriers, just doing tool and die work for just above minimum wage, taking the bus, and he said to the bus operator, how can I do what you do? And he came here in the mid-'80s, spent the next 30 years here. But I thought, here's another example of, I just saw him as another black man, and to find out the depth of his story and the strength of his character and the success that he had in his personal life, that he had in his professional life in his home country, to come here and how do we get those stories out so it's not black and white, man and female, but it's Doug and Bill and Denisha and Carlos and whatever the names are, that each person feels they're welcome to work here, they're welcome to be customers of RTS, and that we're very conscious about our biases. We set them aside. We're intentional about who's in the room, and we respect them. And when we see barriers, we want to get rid of them. And,
you know, Bill, as you've been talking, I hear a number of things, but two things really stand out. One is that you really have made diversity and inclusion a serious, continuing agenda item for your top managers.
That's right.
And second, you're not just articulating values, you're serious about translating those values into practice at RTS. Those are two messages that I think you clearly conveyed. Looking ahead, what's in the works? What's in your mind about next steps, you and your board, in the area of inclusion and diversity?
So part of our annual practice with the board, we update our succession plan. And what I mean by that is I sit down with my board chair, how long do I think I'll be here? I do that with my direct reports. They do it with their direct reports. And then if you're on the leadership team, you need to identify 2 or 3 people who are able to take over for you should personal or life circumstance cause you not to be here for one reason or another. You know, ideally retirement, but anything sudden or otherwise. And as we went through that, one of the things I keep track of is, does the current team and the team that's coming up, the team that'll be in place 3 and 5 and 10 years from now, are we making a difference at that level? And we're making a difference. It's not as fast as I'd like it to be, but I see individuals that perhaps in years past wouldn't have had a chance are moving up in the organization. And that gives me great hope that what we're doing here is making a difference. for our organization, and if we do it well, it'll make a difference for our community.
Well, Bill, thanks so much for sharing your experience in the very important areas of inclusion and diversity. I appreciate your time today, appreciate your good thinking, and I wish you a great afternoon.